So this habit is particularly important because as we begin to recognize there are other cultures, other traditions, other foods, so many things that young children are experiencing in their own culture, in their own with their own traditions, but also recognizing the beauty of other people's traditions and cultures. So we begin to say that it's really important, and as Art said, we can use these habits to really help us to pay attention to the beauty of the world and also the beauty of each other. And so, one of the critical things that we try to do is listen with understanding and empathy. Now, to get started with that, we might say, for example, I'll model what we might do. So, it's the morning meeting. And, we today, kids, we're going to be getting together and we're going to start by greeting each other. And so we greet each other. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to share. Now, when we're sharing, what will we do that will help us to make sure that we're sitting here and listening to each other with understanding and empathy? What would it look like? What would it sound like? So teachers often say, if I walked into the room and I saw all of you sitting around me and somebody said, oh, wonder what they're doing. It looks like they're listening, but what would I see that would tell me that you're listening? So Art, if you were in the classroom, what do you think I would see that would tell me that the children are listening?
Well, they would be sitting up tall. They would be looking at each other. They would be nodding if they understand. They would be smiling if someone else is smiling. They would be using gestures in their hands to emphasize words, for example. They would be, and they would not be fidgeting with something else, but rather they would be giving their attention to the person who is speaking.
Wow. Well, they'd be doing quite a bit then. And of course, as they get older, they'd be doing it even better than maybe when they're in kindergarten.
Of course.
And then what we would ask is the next question, well, what would it sound like? And we know that in today's world, there are so many things that the kids hear. So they need to have a really highly recognized coded language, giving them language cues. So it's not just, hey, that's awesome. I want to say something too. What would it sound like if I were listening to you and I were in your classroom? What would you hear me saying?
For example, one of the things we would like to have students do is to build on each other's ideas, to paraphrase what one person has said. That may be hard for kindergartners, but gradually we can teach students to listen to and build on each other's ideas before giving their own idea.
So what might you say? What would you say to do that? Like with the young children, you would say what? You would say, be sure that you say something that builds on somebody else's ideas. What kind of language could you use to let the kids know that?
Well, let's hear Johnny's idea, and then you say in your own words what you heard Johnny say. So
There
it
you
would be
go.
putting in your own words what you hear someone else say. Or you might say, I don't understand what Johnny said. Have him say it again. So in other words, I want to understand John and let him explain his idea even more. So probing, asking questions to Johnny, saying in your own words what you've heard him say, all of those would be examples of what it might sound like.
Yeah, what I was pushing and asking Art to do was to really get clear about kids need to hear what the phrases are, what the language is. So it isn't just to say you need to say what somebody else says, but what he said. You can imagine the power of that. If you said, oh, Johnny, thank you so much for sharing. Bena, before you say something that you want to say in your own words what you just heard Johnny say. So now what we're doing is we're saying, that's the kind of language that we want them to get used to, that they can say, I agree with you, but I really understood you, but I need to understand better when you said this. I need to understand whether this is what you meant when you said. In other words, giving them some of those stems, some of those language stems, so that they're actually beginning to sound like the kind of language that you would like to see happening. And that then gives us a chance to begin to check up on that. So, Art, you want to talk a little bit about what it means when we say, how are we doing?
Yes, notice we have underlined how are we doing, which means that you have students who are working as a group, as a committee, as a team. And so they are assessing themselves uh, in terms of their own listening abilities. Do we listen to each other? Do we interrupt each other? Do we build on each other's ideas? And notice that we have 3 columns here: often, sometimes, and not yet. Now, what does not yet tell you? It means that while we're not doing it yet, we're going to, as a positive hope for the future. So in this kind of a chart, we help students then observe themselves and assess themselves for the criteria of being a good listener. How often are we a good listener? And do we still need to get better at being a good listener?
And as we progress and we get better at it, we begin to shift a little bit. And now we ask the question, how am I doing? How am I doing in this? So the kids can begin to say, I'm going to start taking count of how often do I really hear what somebody else is saying? How often do I really pay attention to that? Do I use some of the language? Do I say, Art, that was very interesting, but I'm not sure I understand. Can you help me so that I can understand better? That would be an example that I could check off and say, okay, sometimes in this conversation, I actually did ask that sort of question because I wanted to understand better what he had to say. On the other hand, if I were interrupting a lot when Art was talking, I might put down a check on not yet, saying, yeah, I'm not doing it yet. I'm still noticing within myself, I tend to interrupt, but I'm going to work on it and I'm going to get better at it. So you notice that these checklists kind of give you a chance to monitor yourself, monitor others in the group, and to help them all begin to understand what it means to listen with understanding and empathy.